You know, every town has that one house, the one that nobody dares to go near, especially on Halloween. Growing up, we had one too. It was a crumbling, two-story Victorian at the end of Blackwood Street. The shutters hung loosely from their hinges, the windows were always dark, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that swallowed up the rusty, forgotten toys scattered about. Every Halloween, kids would dare each other to go knock on the door, but no one ever did, at least not until that one year. I still remember it like it was yesterday, and the more I think about it, the more I wonder how we got out alive. The town doesn't talk about it much anymore, but it still lingers. People moved away, the house was eventually boarded up, and the legend of the house on Blackwood Street became one of those whispered tales told in hushed tones. But it was real. We were there. We saw what happened. And the truth is far more terrifying than any urban legend. They say the house was cursed. The original owners, the Blackwoods, moved in during the late 1800s. Mr. Blackwood was a doctor, well known, respected, and according to the stories, a man with an insatiable curiosity for the occult. His wife, Margaret, was said to be quiet, a woman who kept mostly to herself. But the odd thing was, people said they never saw her outside the house. She was always inside, curtains drawn, watching from the windows. No one knows exactly what happened in that house, but over the years, neighbors claimed to hear strange noises at night. Whispers, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone living, and, most disturbingly, the sound of children laughing. Some said Dr. Blackwood was performing experiments, trying to unlock the secrets of life and death. Others claimed it was something far darker. But whatever the truth was, it all ended one night in 1904 when the house caught fire. The fire consumed the home and took the lives of both Dr. Blackwood and his wife. Their bodies were found in the remains of the basement, burnt beyond recognition. But here's the strangest part. People in town swore they saw someone watching from the window during the fire, a figure standing there, motionless, as the flames devoured the house. After that, no one ever lived in the house again. It was rebuilt, but it was left empty for decades. Over the years, the house fell into disrepair, and the story of the Blackwoods became nothing more than a creepy tale told to scare kids on Halloween. Fast forward to the Halloween of 1995. We were kids, no more than 12 or 13 years old. My friends and I, Tommy, Rachel and Matt, were inseparable. We lived for the thrill of Halloween. Every year, we'd dare each other to do something bigger, scarier. And that year, Tommy had the brilliant idea to break into the Blackwood house. Everyone in town knew the legend, but no one believed it. It was just an old, creepy house, right? Besides, nothing had happened there in years. The plan was simple. We'd sneak in through the back, take a few pictures to prove we'd been there, and leave. No big deal. It was supposed to be fun. But when you're a kid, you don't think about what could go wrong. You don't think about the consequences. And we had no idea what we were walking into. As we approached the house, the wind picked up, blowing leaves across the cracked pavement. The place looked worse than I remembered, like it had decayed more over the past year than it should have. The windows were shattered, the door barely hanging on its hinges. It felt like the house was watching us, waiting for us to make the first move. Tommy, being Tommy, was the first to step up. He grabbed the doorknob, but before he could turn it, the door creaked open on its own. We all froze. Rachel laughed it off, saying it was just the wind, but the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it. None of us did. Still, we went inside. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a staircase that looked like it would collapse if you even glanced at it. But it wasn't the state of the house that made me uneasy. It was the cold. It was freezing inside, colder than it should have been, especially for a house that had been abandoned for years. We stuck together as we explored the first floor, daring each other to open doors and peek into rooms. But every room was the same, empty, decaying, lifeless. That is, until we got to the kitchen. The kitchen was different. It looked preserved, almost. The table was still set with plates and silverware covered in a thin layer of dust, as if someone had left in a hurry but intended to come back. And in the corner, hanging on the wall, was an old, cracked mirror. It was the only thing in the house that didn't seem to belong. Tommy, ever the brave one, walked over to the mirror. He stared into it, and for a moment, none of us said a word. I don't know what it was, but something about the way Tommy looked at that mirror made my skin crawl. His face, he just seemed off, like he wasn't really there anymore. And then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was a whisper, soft, cold, and unfamiliar. "She's coming." We all backed away, terrified, but Tommy just stood there, staring into the mirror. I grabbed his arm and yanked him away, snapping him out of whatever trance he was in. He looked at me like he didn't know where he was. We should have left then. We should have run and never looked back, but we didn't. The house groaned as the wind howled outside, and we heard it. A noise, faint but clear, coming from beneath us. It sounded like something was moving under the floorboards. We found the basement door, hidden behind a stack of broken chairs in the hallway. It wasn't locked, but it took all four of us to pull it open. It felt like something was pushing back. The smell hit us first, damp, rotten, like the air hadn't been disturbed in decades. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the dark. None of us had flashlights, just the weak glow of Tommy's lighter to guide us. And when we reached the bottom, we saw it, the remnants of the fire. Charred beams, ashes, and blackened walls. But in the middle of the room, there was something else. A trapdoor, barely visible beneath the rubble. Tommy wanted to open it. Rachel and I argued, said we should leave. But Tommy was obsessed. He said we had to see what was underneath. So against our better judgment, we helped him clear the debris and pull open the door. Beneath the trapdoor was a small, narrow tunnel. It was barely wide enough for one of us to fit through, and it led into darkness. That's when Rachel said she heard it, whispers, faint and distant, coming from the tunnel. Tommy insisted it was the wind, but I wasn't so sure. Still, we went in. One by one, we crawled through the tunnel, our hearts pounding with every step. And when we reached the end, we found it. A small, hidden room, untouched by the fire. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them filled with something thick and dark. And in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure. The figure didn't move at first. It was dressed in old, tattered clothes, and its face was covered in what looked like a veil. We stood there frozen, waiting for it to do something. But it just stood there, motionless, as if it hadn't noticed us. Then, slowly, it began to turn its head. The veil slipped, and we saw it. What was underneath? The face wasn't human. It was twisted, deformed, like something had stretched the skin too tightly over the bones. Its eyes were black, hollow, and they locked onto us. Tommy screamed. The figure lunged. We ran, scrambling back through the tunnel, tripping over each other in our panic. I don't remember how we made it out, but somehow we did. We didn't stop running until we were back on the street, gasping for breath. Tommy was the last one out. When he finally caught up with us, he wasn't the same. He didn't speak for the rest of the night, and when we asked him what he saw, he just shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. We never spoke about it again, and we never went back to that house. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, the ones from the tunnel. And every Halloween I see her, standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. The house on Blackwood Street still stands today, boarded up, forgotten by most. People pass by it without a second glance, but those of us who were there that night, well, we know better. Tommy moved away the following year. Rachel and I don't speak anymore, and Matt never really recovered. But the house hasn't forgotten us. Every Halloween, without fail, something strange happens. A window breaks, the front door creaks open, and every year, I swear I see that same figure, standing in the shadows, waiting for someone to come back. I've told people about what happened, tried to warn them, but no one believes me. They think it's just a story, something made up to scare kids, but I know the truth. We all do. And if you ever find yourself on Blackwood Street this Halloween, take my advice. Stay away from the house at the end of the road. Because once you step inside, you may never come back out. This is the story of a Halloween party I went to when I was in college. It's been years, and most people have forgotten about it. I wish I could, but I can't. Because the truth is, that party never really ended. At first glance, it seemed like any other college party. Cheap beer, bad costumes, and people you'd never see again after that night. But it wasn't just the people or the music that stayed with me. It was the house, and what happened there still makes my skin crawl to this day. It was Halloween 2008. I was in my sophomore year of college, living off campus with my roommate, Jake. We were planning to hit up the usual bars and maybe hop between a few house parties. Nothing special. But then, a week before Halloween, Jake came back to the apartment with this strange-looking flyer. It wasn't like the typical ones you'd see for a college party. It was printed on thick black paper with gold lettering, and at the top it just said, "The Halloween Party to End All Parties, October 31st, 8 p.m, 144 Oak Ridge Lane." I didn't know anyone who lived on Oak Ridge, but Jake swore it was legit. He said some senior gave him the flyer and told him it was the best party of the year, exclusive, invite only, and legendary. He was pumped, and I figured, why not? It's Halloween, right? Still, something about that flyer bugged me. There was no host name, no social media links, nothing except the address and the date. But I ignored the nagging feeling. I shouldn't have. Halloween night rolled around, and we decided to check out a couple of bars first, have some drinks, then head over to Oak Ridge Lane. By the time we got there, it was already past 9, but the house was easy to spot. It wasn't like the other homes on Oak Ridge. This one was a massive old Victorian, its windows dark, with Halloween decorations strung up all over the yard. Cobwebs, skeletons, and jack-o'-lanterns lined the front path. But something about the house felt wrong, like the decorations were trying too hard to be normal. There was no loud music, no sign of life from inside the house, but we could see people milling around through the front door as it swung open. Jake shrugged and led the way in. The inside was even stranger. There were people, lots of them, but it was eerily quiet. The music playing was some kind of slow, creepy jazz. People stood in small groups, talking in hushed tones. And the costumes, they were elaborate, way too elaborate for a college party. It wasn't just cheap store-bought stuff. There were people in full 19th century attire, complete with wigs and makeup. It felt more like we had walked into a historical reenactment than a Halloween party. I tried to make small talk, but the people were off. They didn't respond like normal. It was almost like they were going through the motions, like they were pretending to be human. And the more I looked around, the more I realized I didn't recognize anyone. I nudged Jake and whispered, "Are you sure this is the right place?" He just laughed it off, grabbed another drink, and wandered into the crowd. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. As the night went on, things started to get weirder. More people showed up, but none of them seemed like college students. They all had that same vacant look in their eyes, their costumes immaculate. Every now and then, I'd catch someone staring at me from across the room, only for them to quickly look away when I noticed. Then, about an hour in, the lights flickered, and the music changed. It wasn't the creepy jazz anymore, it was something else. a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the walls. People started moving toward the center of the room, gathering in a circle. And that's when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a tall man in a long black coat and a white mask that covered his entire face. The mask was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin's face. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, watching. Jake, who by now was pretty drunk, elbowed me and said, "Let's go say hi." Before I could stop him, he was stumbling toward the man. I followed, trying to keep Jake from doing something stupid. When we got close, the masked man turned to look at us. Jake, slurring his words, asked, "What's with the mask, man?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted a hand and pointed toward the staircase at the back of the room. For reasons I still don't understand, Jake took that as an invitation and started heading upstairs. I hesitated, but I didn't want to leave him alone, so I followed. The upstairs of the house was even more unsettling. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls were lined with old portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow us as we made our way down the hallway. The further we went, the darker it got, until we reached a door at the end. Without thinking, Jake pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, except for the faint glow of candles. It looked like a bedroom, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. And there, sitting in the middle of the room, was a large, circular mirror. Jake, still laughing, stumbled toward the mirror and stared at his reflection. I stayed by the door, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't like the way the mirror looked. It was too clean, too perfect, like it didn't belong in that dusty room. Then, Jake's reflection started to change. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. His reflection was smiling, grinning from ear to ear, but Jake wasn't. His real face was expressionless, confused even. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the mirror, his reflection smiling wider and wider. That's when the figure appeared behind him in the mirror, the man in the mask. I screamed for Jake to move, to step away from the mirror, but it was like he couldn't hear me. The masked man in the reflection reached out, his hand brushing Jake's shoulder, and just like that, Jake collapsed. Pause. Part 5. The Disappearance. Minutes 91 to 115. I rushed to his side, shaking him, trying to wake him up, but he was out cold. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and there was no one around. I looked back at the mirror, but the masked man was gone. Jake's reflection was normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I dragged Jake downstairs, but when I got to the main floor, the party was different. The people were still there, but they weren't moving. They stood frozen, staring ahead, their faces blank. And the masked man, he was gone. I ran outside, pulling Jake behind me, and as soon as we crossed the threshold of the house, Jake woke up. He was disoriented, confused, but otherwise fine. He didn't remember anything. Nothing about the man in the mask. Nothing about the mirror. We left without looking back, and as far as I know, no one else from that party ever talked about what happened. The house was torn down a few years later, replaced by a parking lot. But the memory of that night, of the man in the mask, still haunts me. For years, I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was just a bad dream or a Halloween prank that went too far. But every Halloween, without fail, I see him, the man in the mask, not in person, but in reflections, mirrors, windows, puddles. He's always there, watching. Jake never talked about the party again. He moved away after graduation and we lost touch. But last year on Halloween, I got a message from him. It was just one word: help. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. I searched for him online, but there was no trace of him. It's like he vanished, like he was never there to begin with. And now, every Halloween, I wonder, Am I next? Is that why the man in the mask keeps watching me, waiting for the right moment? I don't know what happened at that party, and I don't know what that house was. But one thing I do know. Once you've seen the man in the mask, he never leaves. And if you ever find yourself at a Halloween party that feels too perfect, too quiet, with people who don't quite belong, leave before it's too late.